I'm Eliza Bennett, 32, standing in my grandmother's mansion for our annual family conference, feeling like an alien among relatives dripping in designer labels and luxury watches. Their glittering appearances are a sharp reminder of the silent burden many middle-aged people carry, the ache of always being measured, of always falling short in the eyes of those who equate success with status. My simple blazer and modest jewelry draw condescending whispers and sideways glances. Despite sharing the same bloodline, I've spent 10 years being the target of their mockery over my supposed financial struggles, while silently building my own empire. Little do they know what's in my briefcase today. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and stick around to see how I finally showed my status-obsessed family what real wealth truly looks like. I'm Eliza Bennett, 32 years old, standing in the grand foyer of my late grandmother's mansion, a place that once felt like a safe haven but now feels more like enemy territory. Every year, my family gathers here for what they call the annual family conference, but let's not kid ourselves, it's really just a parade of status and self-congratulation. The marble floors gleam, the crystal chandeliers sparkle, and my relatives? Well, they gleam and sparkle even more, dripping in designer brands and flashing luxury watches as if their worth is stitched into the labels they wear. I, on the other hand, walked in wearing my simple navy blazer from Banana Republic and a modest pair of earrings that belonged to my mother. No one says it out loud, but the glances, the whispers, the tight smiles, they all tell me exactly what they think. I don't belong here. For the past 10 years, I've been the invisible one, the charity case, the poor cousin, the one they politely tolerate but quietly pity. What they never bothered to notice is that while they were busy buying sports cars and vacation homes, I was quietly building something they couldn't even see coming. But we'll get to that. Because standing here, feeling like an outsider in my own family, I can't help but think about the weight that comes with reaching your 30s and realizing that life didn't follow the neat little script you expected. I carry that middle-aged ache, the pressure to prove myself, to catch up, to somehow matter to people who measure worth by the size of your bank account or the brand of your handbag. The Bennett family is practically royalty in Boston real estate. Since the 1920s, when my great-grandfather turned a modest inheritance into a sprawling property empire, the Bennett name has been synonymous with wealth and influence. By the time my grandmother Elizabeth took over in the 70s, the family portfolio was already worth millions. But she wasn't like the rest. While her brothers were obsessed with flash and social status, she quietly focused on solid investments, building wealth that didn't need to scream for attention. She always said that real wealth is what you don't see. It's security, it's freedom, it's the power to create change. My father inherited her mindset. He was her youngest son, the one who fell in love with my mother, a kindergarten teacher with no family fortune, and that, in the eyes of the Bennetts, was practically scandalous. They chose a quiet life in a small suburb, away from the glitz and power games. Dad worked as an architect, designing homes people actually wanted to live in, not monuments to ego. Mom kept teaching, finding joy in the little victories of shaping young minds. They taught me that money was a tool, not a trophy, that a good life wasn't about what you could flaunt, but about what you could build. Then, when I was 15, everything shattered. My parents died in a car accident on their way home from a weekend trip. One phone call, and suddenly, the world tilted off its axis. I was alone. Grandma Elizabeth took me in, the only family member who didn't treat me like some unwanted obligation. Even so, the whispers followed me everywhere. Poor Eliza, the orphan, the charity case. The one who would surely struggle her entire life because she didn't inherit the Bennett instinct for wealth. Those early months with Grandma were a blur of grief and confusion. I'd find her late at night in her study, poring over dusty ledgers and yellowed property records, always with a cup of cold tea by her side. One night, she looked up from her papers and said something I never forgot. Most of this family has forgotten what wealth is actually for. They think it's about showing off, but real wealth, it's invisible. It's having choices. It's being able to make a difference. She made it her mission to teach me everything she knew. While my cousins spent their summers lounging at beach resorts or cruising around in shiny new cars, I sat at Grandma's desk, learning how to read market reports, how to spot undervalued neighborhoods, and how to calculate risk and reward. She taught me patience, that wealth wasn't something you grabbed, it was something you cultivated. Meanwhile, my cousins Brad, Victoria, Taylor, Jessica, and Blake were living in a completely different reality. Uncle Richard, who became the de facto head of the family after my grandfather passed, believed in one thing: appearance. To him, success meant being seen in the right places, driving the right cars, wearing the right clothes. His kids were raised on that gospel. They got sports cars for their 16th birthdays, flew to Europe on school breaks, and wore designer everything. Me? I drove the old Toyota my parents left me, worked part-time jobs, and stashed every extra dollar into savings accounts and small, careful investments. Grandma passed away during my senior year of college. She left each grandchild a small inheritance, not enough to make anyone rich, but enough to plant seeds. My cousins blew through theirs in record time. Brad bought an upscale condo downtown, Victoria went on a 6-month tour through Asia, and Blake bought a yacht he used maybe 3 times. Me? I kept living in my tiny apartment, working quietly and investing strategically. I bought my first property with my inheritance, a little fixer-upper that no one else wanted. While they laughed at me for driving the same car and wearing the same shoes, I was quietly expanding my portfolio, brick by brick. Family meetings, like the one I'm at now, became a yearly tradition. They started as Grandma's way to keep the family grounded, to make sure we all remembered where we came from. After she passed, Uncle Richard turned them into status competitions. Who made the biggest deal? Who bought the flashiest new house? Who climbed the highest corporate ladder? Every year, I sit there in my modest clothes, offering mild, carefully worded updates about my consulting work, enduring their smug smiles and their thinly veiled pity. What they never realized is that while they were busy performing wealth, I was quietly becoming it. As I stand here now, listening to the echoes of their laughter bouncing off marble walls, I feel the weight of middle age pressing on me, not just the pressure to succeed, but the deeper ache of being constantly misunderstood, constantly dismissed by the people who should know me best. It's a particular kind of pain, the one where you realize your family has built a version of you in their minds, and no matter what you do, they refuse to see anything else. But today, that's going to change. Because in the briefcase I'm holding, I carry the truth about who I've become. And it's time they finally see it. The differences between me and the rest of the Bennetts weren't just visible. They were sharp, unavoidable, and, honestly, exhausting. We were all born into the same family tree, but somehow, I had always felt like I was grafted onto the wrong branch. My cousins Brad, Victoria, Blake, Taylor, and even Jessica, though she was kinder, grew up in a world where luxury wasn't an achievement. It was the default. To them, first-class travel was expected, designer clothes were standard, and luxury sports cars were basically coming-of-age gifts. By the time they turned 16, they were parking brand-new BMWs and Porsches in the family driveway. Me? I was still driving the old Toyota my parents left behind, a beat-up car with peeling paint, a sticky gear shift, and a stubborn air conditioner that only worked when it felt like it. While they spent their high school summers jet-setting to the Amalfi Coast or skiing in Aspen, I was working part-time jobs at the local bookstore and waiting tables at a diner just to scrape together enough for college textbooks. They came back from their glamorous vacations with new wardrobes and expensive tans, while I came home from double shifts with aching feet and enough savings to buy my first low-risk mutual fund. But I didn't mind. I had Grandma's voice in my head. You don't need to win today, Eliza. You need to win in 10 years. What stung the most wasn't the difference in lifestyle. It was the way they treated me because of it. The sideways glances, the polite but sharp comments, the running joke that it was the family's charity case. They loved to poke at my so-called minimalist lifestyle as if it were a phase I'd grow out of. Victoria once leaned over during a family brunch and whispered, "Eliza, you really should let Uncle Richard help you." No shame in getting a little boost. Her tone was dripping with condescension masked as concern. I smiled and told her I appreciated the offer, but I was managing just fine. What I didn't tell her was that I'd just closed on my second investment property that week, quietly building my portfolio while she was busy debating whether to buy another Chanel handbag or upgrade her BMW to the latest model. The contrast became even sharper after Grandma passed. She had been the quiet center of the family, the one who actually believed in building something meaningful. Without her, Uncle Richard filled the vacuum, and he didn't hesitate to shape the family in his image, all about public appearances, status symbols, and what he loved to call the Bennett standard. It wasn't just a lifestyle, it was an expectation. If you didn't drive a certain car, live in a certain zip code, or donate to the right galas, you weren't really pulling your weight in the family legacy. My cousins leaned into this with everything they had. Brad landed an executive job, thanks to Richard's company, not his own merit, and loved to talk about his bonuses and his latest vacation home in Aspen. Blake dabbled in tech startups, but mostly bragged about his yacht, which he used just enough to justify its existence. Victoria curated her life like it was an Instagram feed, all private schools, exclusive art collections, and carefully staged charity events. Taylor wasn't far behind, constantly juggling nannies, personal trainers, and the logistics of managing her 3 houses. Me? I stayed quiet. I kept showing up to family conferences in my simple blazers and low-profile shoes, sharing carefully vague updates about my consulting work. They assumed I was scraping by, that I was too proud to ask for help. They pitied me, which was somehow worse than if they had outright disliked me. They believed they were thriving while I was surviving, and that belief gave them a comfortable sense of superiority. What they never realized was that I'd spent the last decade quietly outperforming them, not in flashy ways, but in the ways that actually matter. While they were tying their wealth to things that depreciate the second you drive them off the lot, I was investing in assets that grow while you sleep. Grandma had taught me to buy properties in neighborhoods that were on the verge of revitalization, not the ones already filled with overpriced coffee shops and luxury boutiques. I bought small duplexes, rundown apartments, and overlooked commercial spaces that everyone else ignored. I wasn't chasing prestige. I was building security. They invested in their image. I invested in my future. The annual family conferences were the worst. They were supposed to be about aligning the family's vision and reviewing the health of our collective holdings, but they turned into pageants of success. Uncle Richard always kicked things off with a slideshow of the latest Bennett projects, most of which were about maximizing profit and visibility. Then, one by one, each cousin would present their updates, which were basically humble brags wrapped in PowerPoints. New houses, new cars, new designer collections, new business ventures. It was all about who had the biggest, the best, the most. Every year, I'd sit there, sipping water while Brad droned on about his custom-built Maserati, or while Victoria detailed the renovations on her 3rd vacation home. They'd ask me about my work in the same way people ask about the weather, polite, surface level, and entirely uninterested. Aunt Catherine always made a point of gently suggesting that I could do so much more if I just let Richard mentor me, as if the only path to success was the one he paved. But the truth was, I didn't need their help. I didn't need their network. I had something far more valuable: the patience to play the long game, and the discipline to live beneath my means. I had bought properties under anonymous LLCs, expanding my portfolio without drawing attention. I had saved and reinvested every extra dollar, resisted the temptation to spend just to prove something, and trusted that Grandma's advice would pay off. And it did. The most ironic part? Several of my cousins, including Victoria and Blake, were actually renting apartments in a building I secretly owned. They had no idea. They complained about the management, about the minor rent increases, about the construction noise from the lobby renovations, all changes I had personally authorized to improve the property's long-term value. It wasn't just about the money. It was about proving, at least to myself, that I could build something without having to wave it in anyone's face. I didn't need to show up in a Bentley to know my worth. I didn't need a designer wardrobe to validate my choices. I had spent my 20s and early 30s quietly becoming everything they assumed I wasn't. And yet, despite all of this, they still saw me as the poor cousin, the one barely hanging on, the one who might need a family stipend just to stay afloat. Their perception of me had fossilized into something I couldn't break, not because I hadn't changed, but because they refused to see past their assumptions. Until now, I came to this family conference knowing I wasn't just here to endure another round of their condescension. I was here to rewrite the story they had written about me. I was here to finally show them who I really am. The Bennett family wasn't always like this. Once, long ago, we actually gathered because we wanted to. Back when Grandma Elizabeth was alive, the annual family conference felt like a real reunion, a chance to reconnect, to share stories, to feel like we were part of something larger than ourselves. Grandma always said that wealth was a responsibility, not a trophy. She would host these weekends not to parade our successes, but to remind us of our roots, to encourage us to think about legacy, stewardship, and the importance of building something that would outlast us. But after Grandma passed, everything changed. Uncle Richard took the helm, and almost immediately, the tone of the family conferences shifted. What used to be about connection slowly morphed into a competition, an endless, exhausting game of one-upmanship. The focus moved from shared purpose to personal gain, from honoring the past to outshining each other in the present. Under Richard's leadership, family meetings became less about unity and more about who could flash the most impressive financial portfolio. Richard turned the conferences into something structured and transactional. Instead of informal discussions around the fireplace, we now sat in meticulously arranged meeting rooms with printed agendas, digital presentations, and scheduled time slots for each family member to showcase their annual achievements. Everything had to be quantified. Success was measured in square footage, portfolio growth, and net worth. Contributions to the family's holdings were tallied and displayed on massive projector screens for everyone to see, color-coded charts that made it painfully clear who was winning and who, in their eyes, was falling behind. This new structure wasn't accidental. Richard believed that by tying family influence directly to financial contributions, he could motivate everyone to raise the Bennett standard. What he really did was create an invisible hierarchy that divided us more than ever. Your voice at the table wasn't based on your experience, your ideas, or your loyalty to the family. It was based on how much wealth you visibly controlled. The more you owned, the louder your vote. It was a brilliant move if the goal was to keep power in his hands. And my cousins? They bought into it completely. They started treating the annual conference like it was a competition for Richard's approval. Each year, they arrived in newer cars, wearing more expensive clothes, armed with more impressive financial updates. They weren't just reporting their success, they were performing it. Victoria would spend weeks curating the perfect slideshow of her art acquisitions and her children's admissions to elite private schools. Brad loved to linger on photos of his new vacation properties and his growing fleet of luxury vehicles. Blake would casually mention his latest yacht upgrades or drop the names of high-profile tech investors he'd supposedly brushed shoulders with. They loved the attention, the nods of approval, the subtle but intoxicating power that came with impressing Richard. It wasn't enough to be successful. You had to make sure everyone knew it. Meanwhile, I stayed on the sidelines. My updates were always brief, deliberately understated. I spoke vaguely about my consulting work, about small, stable investments. I never offered details. I never needed to. In their minds, I was still the poor cousin barely hanging on, still driving that ancient Toyota, still living in the same modest apartment. They thought they were lapping me in this imaginary race. What they didn't realize was that we weren't even running on the same track. While they were chasing visible status symbols, I was building quiet, sustainable wealth. I wasn't interested in being the loudest or the flashiest. I wanted freedom. I wanted security. I wanted options. Grandma had taught me that true wealth isn't about what you can show, it's about what you can walk away from. I was creating a life where I didn't have to impress anyone to feel worthy. But of course, in the new Bennett family order, a life without designer labels and exclusive memberships was a life not worth noticing. The divide deepened every year. The conferences became almost unbearable. The opening dinners turned into victory laps for my cousins. The financial review sessions were pressure cookers where your entire family's standing was reduced to a few digits on a spreadsheet. And then there was the final day, the day Richard called the individual highlights showcase, where each family member was expected to present their personal financial growth over the past 12 months. It was never just a review. It was a test. A public evaluation. Richard made sure of that. And with every passing year, the expectation to outperform, to outshine, to outclimb grew heavier. There was no ceiling, no finish line. No matter how much wealth they accumulated, they had to keep proving themselves, keep climbing higher, keep chasing a moving target that Richard always made sure was just out of reach. The worst part was watching how this culture bled into every corner of their lives. Brad stopped making decisions based on what he actually wanted. Instead, he chose properties, cars, vacations based on how they would be perceived by the rest of the family. Victoria's entire identity became wrapped up in her social circles and curated lifestyle, always calculating how each event, each donation, each Instagram post would bolster her image. Even Blake, who started off chasing passion projects, eventually caved to the need for recognition, pouring money into ventures he didn't believe in just to have something impressive to present at the next conference. They were all so desperate to be seen as winners that they forgot what they were supposed to be winning. Jessica was the only one who seemed to see the cracks forming. Over quiet breakfasts or evening walks, she'd admit to feeling exhausted by the constant comparison, by the pressure to perform. Even though she lived comfortably, she still remembered what Grandma had taught us. She understood, at least a little, that this wasn't the life Grandma wanted for us. But even Jessica, kind and reasonable as she was, played along in her own way. She wore the right brands, drove the right car, and maintained the right social presence. She didn't fully opt out the way I did. I don't blame her. Opting out meant becoming invisible. Opting out meant being the family disappointment. And that's exactly how they saw me. The family disappointment. The one who didn't live up to the Bennett name. The one who didn't attend the right galas, didn't drive the right car, didn't contribute enough to matter. In their eyes, I was just a footnote in the family story, someone to be pitied, maybe gently patronized, but never truly respected. It hurt more than I liked to admit. There's something uniquely painful about being dismissed by your own blood. About knowing they've written you off without ever asking who you really are or what you've really been building. But that pain, that deep ache of being overlooked, became fuel. I carried it with me quietly as I kept working, kept investing, kept growing. They saw me as small because I let them, because it suited me to fly under the radar. But the truth is, I wasn't small. I was simply waiting for the right moment to show them. The turning point, the thing that cracked whatever was left of my fragile patience, came when Uncle Richard announced his plan to sell Grandma's mansion. I'd heard whispers about it in the weeks leading up to the conference, but hearing it confirmed hit me harder than I expected. This house wasn't just bricks and marble and antique woodwork. It was the last tangible piece of Grandma's legacy, the physical space where she'd taught me what wealth really meant, where she'd told me stories about our family's beginnings, where she made me feel like I still had a home after losing my parents. It wasn't just a building. It was sacred ground. But to Uncle Richard, it was just a 5-acre slice of prime real estate. And to him, Prime real estate should never sit still. He introduced the idea on the first morning of the conference, like it was just another business update. He clicked a slide showing the mansion in perfect, sunlit detail and spoke in his usual measured, persuasive tone. "This property has served its purpose," he said, as if he were talking about an outdated office printer. "We have an opportunity to unlock significant value by redeveloping the land. Westbrook Development has already submitted a preliminary offer. Their vision is to create a luxury condominium complex that aligns with the Bennett brand." The room nodded along, some cousins visibly excited by the potential payout. Aunt Catherine chimed in with her usual air of fake diplomacy. "Of course, we understand some family members may feel emotionally attached to the house," she said, her gaze sliding toward me like a velvet-covered dagger. "But we must think practically. Grandma would have wanted us to make sound financial decisions." It was almost funny. These were the same people who barely spoke to Grandma in her final years. The same people who skipped Sunday dinners because their social calendars were too packed. Now, suddenly, they were experts on what Grandma would have wanted. Blake jumped in next, completely missing the emotional weight of the conversation. "Honestly, this is a no-brainer. The market's hot. The return on investment is ridiculous. It's smart to move quickly." "You know what else is smart?" Brad added, smirking in my direction. "Getting rid of emotional baggage. We can't build the future if we're clinging to the past." The words stung more than they should have. But what really twisted the knife was that they truly believed this was just a financial discussion. To them, the mansion was just another asset to be liquidated, another trophy to be cashed in. They didn't see what it really was. A cornerstone of our family's story, a space filled with memories, lessons, and the quiet kind of wealth Grandma valued most. I glanced across the room and caught Jessica's eye. Her expression told me she felt it too, the gut punch of losing not just a house, but the last anchor to something real in our family. After the session, Jessica found me in the rose garden, where Grandma used to spend her afternoons tending to the flowers with bare hands and a wide-brimmed hat. "I knew Richard was going to push for this eventually," she said quietly, sitting beside me on the stone bench. "But I didn't think they'd all fall in line so easily." "They've been falling in line for years," I muttered, staring at the blooming roses that Grandma had once called her sanctuary. "Money's the only language they speak now." "You're going to fight this, aren't you?" "I have to." Jessica squeezed my hand. "I'll back you. But be ready. Richard's got most of the votes. He's already working the numbers." That's when it hit me how deep this game had become. The Bennett family governance structure wasn't just a formality. Richard had carefully crafted a system where votes were weighted based on declared financial contributions to the family holdings. Naturally, with his empire and his children's flashy portfolios, he and his allies controlled the majority. My official holdings, the ones I let them see, gave me a pathetic 2% voting share. I could scream and protest all I wanted, but under the current rules, I was outnumbered from the start. And Richard knew it. He wasn't just confident, he was calculating. He'd already arranged developer presentations, financial models, and a timeline that pushed the sale through quickly. He had architects lined up, brochures printed, and contracts ready to distribute. To him, this was a done deal. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been preparing for this moment for years. The mansion was more than just a house to me, but I wasn't going to win this fight with sentimental speeches. Not with this family. I needed leverage. Real, undeniable leverage. And it just so happened that I had it. I'd spent the last decade quietly building a property portfolio under anonymous holding companies, expanding my influence without anyone noticing. And the crown jewel? The luxury apartment complex where Blake, Victoria, and a few other family members currently lived. The very building they had just complained about over lunch, oblivious to who actually owned it. Their plan was to pressure the mystery owner into selling. They had no idea they were planning to bully me. The irony was delicious, but I didn't savor it. Not yet. Because the truth was, I wasn't just trying to block a sale. I was trying to protect the last piece of Grandma's world. The last space that hadn't been tainted by the family's obsession with status. And I needed to do it in a way that they couldn't ignore, couldn't dismiss, couldn't vote away. Later that night, in the quiet of my childhood bedroom, I called Mr. Winters, Grandma's old attorney and my longtime advisor. I told him everything about the planned sale, about the family's strategy, about the pressure they intended to apply to the apartment complex owner. When I told him that the owner was me, he just laughed softly. "Eliza," he said, "you've been playing a brilliant long game." "I'm done hiding," I told him. "I need to consolidate. I need to show them exactly who they've been underestimating all these years." Together, we mapped out the plan. I would transfer all my holdings to a new entity, Elizabeth's Legacy Trust, a structure that would give me immediate control over a significant share of Bennett family holdings. More than enough to block the mansion sale. More than enough to finally stand toe-to-toe with Richard. As I hung up the phone, I felt something shift inside me. The years of quiet endurance, the years of letting them laugh, letting them look down on me, it all led to this. I wasn't just going to stop them. I was going to make them see me. The irony of it all hit me like a slow-burning wildfire during Sunday's family meeting. Sitting there in the grand drawing room, surrounded by the polished wood, the antique chandeliers, and the thinly veiled arrogance of my family, I listened as they casually plotted how to pressure the unknown owner of the luxury apartment complex where several of them lived. The building they were so eager to control. The building they had been complaining about all weekend. The building I secretly owned. Uncle Richard, ever the tactician, leaned forward in his chair, his voice dripping with fake patience. "We need to secure that building. It's strategically positioned, and it houses several Bennett family members. Having control would ensure that our family standards are properly maintained." What he meant, of course, was that he wanted to own it so he could dictate everything from rent prices to who could step foot in the lobby. It wasn't about protecting the family. It was about power. It was always about power. Brad jumped in immediately. "The new management is making changes I don't like. The lobby renovations are noisy. They raised the rent last quarter, and honestly, they're acting like they don't know who we are." Victoria, still bitter about the guest registration policy she'd been whining about for 2 days, crossed her arms and added, "I had to register my housekeeper as a recurring visitor. Can you believe that?" The nerve. Blake, who always needed to chime in, muttered, "The whole vibe is different. The new owner clearly doesn't understand who they're dealing with." I sat there in complete silence, sipping my water, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. The building wasn't managed by some faceless corporation. The nerve they were so outraged about? That was me. Does the policy change? Mine. The rent adjustments? Mine. The lobby renovations they found so inconvenient? Yep, all mine. But the best part? They had no idea. Richard tapped his pen against his portfolio and said, "Jenkins found some leads on the ownership. The building was purchased by Horizon Holdings last year, which is controlled by Summit Investments. Summit is tied to an offshore entity with layers of privacy protections. Clearly, they're trying to stay hidden. But we have options." He looked around the room, his gaze full of calculated promise. "We have friends at the city planning office who can slow down or even block future renovation approvals. We can push for more aggressive code compliance checks. If we apply enough pressure, the current owner will have no choice but to sell." The room buzzed with agreement. They saw this as just another business maneuver. They didn't think twice about using their influence to harass a property owner into submission. They didn't care who got hurt along the way. And why would they? In their minds, the owner was probably some out-of-town investor, an outsider, someone they could crush without consequence. They didn't know they were trying to crush me. Jessica, sitting beside me, shot me a glance that said she was already uncomfortable with the entire conversation. She wasn't like the others. She never enjoyed the power plays. But even she didn't know the full story yet. Blake leaned back in his chair and smirked. Besides, if we own the building, we can reset the rents to something more reasonable for family members. We deserve that. It was like they were trying to hand me the perfect moment on a silver platter. I kept my expression carefully neutral, nodding occasionally, as if I were just another spectator in the room. But inside, I was seething. Not because they were targeting me, that part was almost comical, but because this was exactly the kind of entitled, abusive behavior Grandma despised. She always told me that wealth was a responsibility, not a weapon. Watching them so casually plot to weaponize their influence was the final confirmation that they had forgotten everything she tried to teach us. After the meeting, I walked the familiar halls of the mansion, the weight of what was coming pressing against my chest. The truth is, I'd spent years building this exact moment. The anonymous LLCs, the careful layers of ownership, the quiet purchases that no one in the family noticed. All of it led here. The apartment complex was the centerpiece of my portfolio, and it wasn't just a financial win. It was personal. It was strategic. It was leverage. But now I have to decide when and how to reveal it. That evening, after everyone had scattered for dinner plans and spa appointments, I called Mr. Winters from the privacy of my old bedroom. I explained everything, the family's plan to pressure the owner, their proposed legal tactics, their city hall connections. They think they can corner me, I said, pacing the room. They're preparing to go after their own. Mr. Winters chuckled softly, his calm confidence grounding me. Your ownership structure is airtight, Eliza. They'll never connect the dots unless you want them to. Good. But I think it's time to let them see the dots. I told him I was ready to consolidate everything under the new entity we had discussed, Elizabeth's Legacy Trust. Not just for the mansion vote, but for the apartment complex and all my other holdings. It was time to stop hiding. It was time to show them exactly who they had been underestimating all these years. Are you sure? He asked gently. Once you reveal yourself, everything changes. They can't unsee it. I'm sure. They need to see it. When I hung up, I felt something settle in me. A sharp clarity. All those years of being overlooked, dismissed, pitted, they had protected me. They had allowed me to build without interference. But now it was time to step into the light. Not because I needed their approval. Not because I wanted to impress them. Because I was done letting them believe they could push me around. Because Grandma's legacy deserved to be protected by someone who actually understood what it meant. And because sometimes the most satisfying power move is letting people walk straight into a battle they never saw coming. The night before the final day of the conference, I sat alone in my childhood bedroom, the one that still smelled faintly of old books and lavender, the one where Grandma used to tuck me in when I was too small to understand the weight of the world. The house was quiet now, except for the distant hum of the garden lights outside. My leather portfolio lay open across the bed, papers neatly organized, ownership documents lined up in precise order, like soldiers waiting for battle. I traced my fingers over the title deeds and financial summaries, the careful record of everything I'd built over the last decade. 15 properties. 3 commercial buildings. The luxury apartment complex that had become the unexpected centerpiece of this unfolding story. The net worth that would leave even Uncle Richard speechless. I wasn't nervous. I thought I would be. But instead, I felt calm, steady. Like I had finally grown into the version of myself Grandma always knew I could become. For years, I had let them misjudge me. I let them label me the poor cousin, the quiet disappointment, the girl who didn't quite measure up. And maybe, for a long time, some part of me still wanted to be accepted by them, still wanted to prove I belonged. But tonight, that desire felt distant. Like an old coat I'd finally outgrown. This wasn't about proving anything to them anymore. This was about honoring Grandma's legacy. About protecting the values she spent her life trying to pass down. About showing them, finally, fully, who I really was. Mr. Winters had delivered the final documents earlier that evening. The official formation of Elizabeth's Legacy Trust. The transfer of all my assets into it. The acquisition of Jenkins Development, the company that quietly held a 30% stake in Bennett Family Holdings. The consolidation was complete. My voting power was no longer insignificant. I controlled 35% now, enough to block any major decision. Enough to stop the sale of the mansion. Enough to shift the balance they had carefully built against me. Tomorrow, they will see. But even as I stacked the papers neatly into my portfolio, I knew the reveal would cost me something. The version of me they had believed in, helpless, harmless, forgettable, was about to shatter. They would never look at me the same way again. Some would resent me. Some would scramble to realign their loyalties. Some would pretend they had always believed in me. None of it mattered. What mattered was that I was finally stepping out from behind the version of me they had created. I chose my outfit carefully, a simple, perfectly tailored charcoal suit I had bought in New York last year, but never worn. Not flashy, not designer labeled, but quietly sharp, the kind of suit that didn't need to announce itself. I paired it with Grandma's pearl necklace, the one piece of family jewelry I had kept all these years. Understated, elegant, and a silent reminder of who I was doing this for. Around midnight, there was a soft knock at my door. Jessica. I let her in, quickly covering the documents spread across the bed, but she had already seen enough to know something was up. Eliza, she whispered, her eyes widening as she caught a glimpse of the property titles and corporate ownership charts. What is all this? For a moment, I considered brushing her off, but I was tired of carrying this alone. So I told her. Everything. The properties, the apartment complex, trust, the voting power. Her jaw dropped as she sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to process what I had just said. You're the owner, she asked, still stunned. The building they've been complaining about all weekend, that's yours? I nodded. All those years they've been treating you like you're struggling, like you're barely getting by, and you've been, she shook her head, almost laughing. You've been quietly outpacing all of them. I never needed their approval, I said softly. But I do need to protect this house. I do need to protect Grandma's legacy. Jessica looked at me with something between awe and deep respect. You're really going to do this tomorrow? I have to. She squeezed my hand. I'll be right there with you. After she left, I packed my portfolio, checked everything twice, and finally, for the first time in years, slept soundly in that old familiar bed. The next morning, the air felt crisp, the sky almost painfully clear. I arrived early to the conference room, placed my portfolio precisely at my seat, and stepped out for a moment to gather my thoughts. By 9 o'clock, the family had assembled in their usual arrangement. Richard stood at the head of the table, his posture full of confidence, already beginning to outline the sale agreements for the mansion. They were eager, practically salivating over the projected profits, excited to sign the documents that would dismantle what Grandma had spent a lifetime building. Before we move forward, I said, rising from my seat, my voice firm but calm, I'd like to request the floor for a brief presentation. Richard glanced at his watch, clearly impatient. We have a tight schedule today, Eliza. The developers are waiting. This won't take long. I walked to the front of the room, opened my portfolio, and carefully placed a single document on the table, the most recent valuation of my complete holdings. For years, I've listened to the assumptions about my financial situation, I began, scanning the room, making eye contact with each of them. I've heard the whispers about the poor cousin. I've endured the condescension, the pity, the mockery. Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Victoria stared at her nails. Yesterday, Uncle Richard presented a graph showing each family member's contribution to our collective wealth. I think it's time we update that data. I handed the valuation summary to Richard's assistant, who projected it onto the screen. The number was impossible to ignore. $73 million. A stunned silence filled the room. The oxygen seemed to vanish. This can't be right, Brad stammered, his face flushing. There must be some mistake. No mistake, I replied smoothly. While you've been buying sports cars and vacation homes, I've been building a real estate portfolio that now outperforms most of yours combined. I distributed copies of my full financial statement, watching their faces shift from disbelief to shock to something like fear. But you live in that tiny apartment, Aunt Catherine protested weakly. You drive that old car. By choice, I said, not by necessity. Richard flipped through the documents, his face pale. How did you manage this without family connections? Without our network? I used the principles Grandma taught me. Patience, discipline, strategy. Values this family seems to have long since abandoned. I placed another document on the table. As for the mysterious owner of the apartment complex you were planning to pressure, I slid it directly in front of Victoria. You were planning to pressure me. The room erupted in chaos. And just like that, the story they'd written about me was gone. The conference room descended into chaos the moment I revealed that I was the owner of the apartment complex they'd been plotting to pressure. Brad knocked over his water glass, Victoria's mouth fell open in stunned silence, and Uncle Richard, usually so composed, flipped furiously through the financial statements as if he might find a loophole that would make this all go away. They didn't. They wouldn't. Because the truth was now sitting right in front of them, printed in black and white. All those years they called me the poor cousin, the struggling one, the invisible one. They had no idea I was the landlord collecting their rent checks. They had no idea I was the quiet force managing the renovations they loved to complain about. They had no idea I had spent years building leverage right under their noses. The silence that followed my announcement was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Brad, of course, recovered first. He always did. This is some kind of trick, he snapped, pushing his chair back with unnecessary force. You can't just swoop in and take control after contributing nothing to the family business all these years. I met his glare head-on. I didn't take control, Brad. I prevented the dismantling of Grandma's legacy. There's a difference. Uncle Richard, still clinging to the last shreds of authority, cleared his throat. Even if this is all true, he said carefully, it doesn't change the voting structure. The agreements for the mansion sale are based on established shareholder percentages. You can't block the sale with just your votes. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I placed one final document on the table, the incorporation papers for Elizabeth's Legacy Trust and the proof of its acquisition of Jenkins Development. Actually, I said calmly, there's been a recent change in the ownership structure. As of this morning, I've transferred all of my holdings to Elizabeth's Legacy Trust, which also now owns Jenkins Development. Richard's face drained of color as the realization hit him. That's not possible. We would have known. Would you? I asked, my voice steady, almost gentle. You were all so sure of my insignificance that you never bothered to look closely at what I was actually doing. I let that sink in before continuing. With the consolidation, I now control 35% of Bennett family holdings. Not a majority, but enough to block any major decision, including the sale of this mansion. The room fell into another stunned silence, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever. Even Brad was speechless, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't quite find the words. Jessica, bless her, finally broke the tension. She leaned back in her chair and offered me a slow, deliberate clap. Well played, cousin. Grandma would be proud. Aunt Catherine tried to recover with a weak smile. Eliza, dear, surely we can find a compromise. Perhaps we can still proceed with part of the development while preserving a section of the mansion. The sale is off the table, I said, cutting her off. My voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried all the weight it needed. And as for the apartment complex, don't worry. I have no plans to evict anyone, though I will be reviewing the rather generous rent discounts some of you have been enjoying. Victoria flushed a deep shade of red, quickly looking down at her papers. Brad shifted uncomfortably. Blake just shook his head, still processing. Uncle Richard, always the strategist, quickly recalibrated. His face softened, his tone shifting into something almost collaborative. Perhaps we should discuss a more unified approach going forward. It's clear we underestimated your contributions, Eliza. Maybe it's time we revisit Grandma's original vision for the family legacy, one focused on stewardship. I think that's wise, I agreed, but I didn't let him off that easily. We'll start by reviewing the governance structure and re-establishing safeguards to ensure no single family member can dominate decisions again. He nodded, but there was something behind his eyes, an understanding that the balance of power had permanently shifted. After the meeting, the dynamic among us was completely different. The cousins who had spent years dismissing me now offered hesitant smiles, awkward compliments, and invitations to collaborate on future projects. Richard invited me to lunch at his private club, a place where, until now, I was never welcome. And Catherine sent a carefully worded email suggesting we might work together on philanthropic initiatives. Brad called me a few days later with a thinly veiled business proposal, pretending it was about synergy, but really hoping to tap into my capital. None of them fooled me. They hadn't suddenly found respect for me. They had simply realized they couldn't afford to ignore me anymore. Jessica and I stayed close. She was the only one who had truly supported me before all of this, and she remained my most trusted ally. We met for coffee a week later, still laughing about the stunned expressions at the conference. It's like watching a nature documentary, she joked. Observe as the Bennett family members adjust to the emergence of a new apex predator. We both laughed, but we both knew the truth. My position had changed, but the core of who I was hadn't. I still lived in my modest apartment. I still drove the same Toyota. I still didn't care about the status games they played. But now they knew that was a choice, not a limitation. The mansion, the one they had been so eager to sell, became the headquarters of the Elizabeth Bennett Foundation. Instead of being demolished for condos, it now hosted community programs, financial literacy workshops, and affordable housing initiatives, exactly the kind of impact Grandma would have wanted. The same cousins who once mocked me now attended the foundation's events, smiling for the cameras and pretending they had always believed in the mission. I let them pretend. It didn't matter. They could posture all they wanted. I knew the truth. I had reclaimed the soul of our family's legacy, and no one could take that away. Richard eventually adapted, shifting his tone and his approach, always careful now to treat me as an equal. But I never forgot the years he spent overlooking me. I worked with him when it made sense, but I kept my distance. Brad never quite recovered from the blow to his ego. He tried, of course, tried to laugh it off, tried to play the long-lost supportive cousin, but the bitterness never really left his voice. Victoria avoided me for months, embarrassed by the years she'd spent pitying me. Eventually, she came around, mostly because she had to. But we were never close. And that was fine. Because I didn't need them to like me. I didn't need them to understand me. I just needed them to see me. And now they did. The aftermath of that revelation hit the room like a tidal wave. I watched the carefully constructed hierarchy within the Bennett family collapse in real time. Brad sputtered, trying to find some ground to stand on. Victoria's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to argue, but no words came out. Uncle Richard's expression flickered through shock, disbelief, and something that looked suspiciously like panic before he quickly masked it with his usual business-like composure. It didn't matter. The damage was done. The story they had built around me, the poor cousin, the charity case, the quiet underachiever, was gone. They could no longer fit me into their neat little narrative. I had shattered it, and now they had to deal with me. On my terms. As I sat back down, calmly tucking my portfolio away, the weight in the room shifted. For the first time, they actually looked at me. Not through the lens of pity or superiority, but as someone they had deeply, embarrassingly underestimated. Perhaps we should discuss more collaborative approach to family holdings moving forward, Richard said, his tone carefully measured, but noticeably more respectful than it had been just minutes before. Gone was the dismissive edge. Gone was the thinly veiled condescension. Now his voice held something else, uncertainty. I met his gaze evenly. I think that's a wise idea. Starting with a review of Grandma's original vision for the family. Stewardship, not status. Thoughtful growth, not reckless displays. The others fidgeted in their seats, unsure how to recalibrate their relationship with me. Brad, who had spent years mocking me, suddenly became very interested in the details of my investment strategy. Victoria, who had once called me the minimalist cousin as an insult, now wore a tight, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Aunt Catherine, ever the social tactician, offered to host me at her country club for tea, pretending like we'd always been close. It was fascinating to watch them scramble. They had spent years dismissing me. Now they wanted to reposition me. They wanted to absorb me back into the fold, this time as a powerful ally. Richard was the quickest to pivot. The very next day, he invited me to a private lunch at his exclusive club, a place I had never been welcomed before. "Clearly, I've underestimated you," he said, studying me across the white linen tablecloth as if trying to solve a puzzle he thought he'd already completed. "Perhaps we've all been too focused on traditional markers of success. Maybe it's time we start thinking about legacy in a broader sense." It was a clever attempt to reframe the situation, to find common ground, but I could still hear the edge of strategy in his voice. He wasn't interested in family unity. He was interested in control. Now that he couldn't ignore me, he wanted to find a way to use me. "Grandma always said we've confused the substance of wealth with its symbols," I replied calmly. "I'm not interested in expanding influence for influence's sake." He nodded thoughtfully, but his eyes still searched for an angle. Over the next few days, the shift in family dynamics became even more obvious. Aunt Catherine reached out, offering to introduce me to her philanthropic contacts. She suddenly seemed to remember that I had always been passionate about community work, though, of course, she had never cared before. Brad sent me a detailed proposal for a development project he wanted me to co-invest in, positioning it as a unique opportunity that would benefit the entire family, the same Brad who, just days ago, openly laughed at my old car and second-hand furniture. But not everyone's response was purely self-serving. Jessica remained the one steady, authentic connection I had throughout all of this. She didn't suddenly see me differently because of my net worth. She had always seen me. She had always known there was more to my story than I had let on. "It's like watching a nature documentary," she joked one morning over coffee. "The Bennetts adapting to a new apex predator in their natural habitat." We laughed, but the truth behind her words stayed with me. They weren't changing because they understood me now. They were changing because they had to. I choose carefully who I am allowed to get close after that. Some relationships, like the one with Jessica, grew stronger, more honest, more real. Others, like Aunt Catherine's suddenly enthusiastic invitations, I kept at a polite distance. I knew which offers came from genuine curiosity and which came from a desperate attempt to stay aligned with power. Richard kept pushing for more joint ventures. He wanted to combine our holdings, leverage our assets, restore the family's prominence, as he put it. But I made it clear that any future collaboration would have to align with Grandma's principles. Community investment, sustainable growth, ethical stewardship. He pretended to be interested. I pretended to believe him. Meanwhile, I quietly made moves to solidify my own path. The first was to officially establish the Elizabeth Bennet Foundation, using the mansion, not as a luxury development, but as its headquarters. The very place they had planned to demolish now served as the center of affordable housing initiatives, financial literacy programs, and community support projects. The irony was delicious. The same family members who had mocked me, who had voted to tear the house down, now attended foundation galas held within its carefully preserved walls. They shook hands with donors, posed for photos in front of Grandma's rose garden, and publicly aligned themselves with the mission they had once called sentimental and impractical. I kept my modest apartment. I kept my old Toyota. Not because I couldn't afford more, but because those things were no longer symbols of limitation. They were symbols of choice. And now, they all understood that. No one laughed at my car anymore. Even Brad eventually stopped making jokes. He still tried to pull me into his ventures, still tried to ride the wave of my influence, but the tone was different now. He asked rather than assumed. He listened rather than lectured. Victoria, for all her initial resistance, found a new interest in the Foundation's community projects. Maybe it was genuine, maybe it was image management, it didn't really matter to me. What mattered was that she no longer dismissed me. Richard, ever the strategist, adjusted the fastest. He never apologized, he didn't have it in him, but his invitations became more frequent, his proposals more collaborative, his respect more visible. I had changed the room. I had changed the story. But I hadn't changed who I was. I still lived simply. I still invested quietly. I still followed Grandma's teachings about patience and purpose. The only difference was that now they finally saw me. Not as the poor cousin. Not as an outsider. But as the one who understood the true meaning of wealth all along. In the aftermath of everything, the revelation, the confrontation, the sudden shift in family dynamics, what stayed with me the most wasn't the shock on their faces, or even the way the power balance flipped overnight. What stayed with me was something quieter, something harder to explain, the realization that true wealth was never about the money. It wasn't about who owned the most properties or who drove the fastest car. It wasn't about winning a status game that was never worth playing to begin with. It was about freedom. Freedom to live life on your own terms. Freedom to choose how you spend your time, who you let into your circle, what kind of person you become when no one's watching. Freedom to walk away from things that don't align with your values, even if everyone else is chasing them. For years, I let my family's narrative about me shape the way I showed up in their world. I let them call me the poor cousin. I let them dismiss me. I let them believe I was someone who needed their help, someone who hadn't figured it out. And maybe, in a strange way, I needed to let them believe that because it gave me space to grow quietly, without their interference, without their expectations suffocating me. But somewhere along the way, I started to believe a little bit of their story too. I told myself I didn't care what they thought, but deep down, part of me did. Part of me wanted them to see me, to finally understand that I wasn't a failure, that I wasn't someone to be pitied. Part of me thought I needed their recognition to prove that I mattered. But here's what I learned. You don't need to prove anything to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Success is not about convincing the people who never really looked at you. It's not about forcing someone else to see your worth. It's about knowing your own worth, even if no one else does. Grandma used to tell me that real wealth isn't flashy. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. Real wealth is steady. It's patient. It's the kind that grows in silence and shows up when you need it the most. It's the kind that gives you security, not just financial security, but emotional security, the ability to stand firm in who you are. Her lessons stuck with me in ways I didn't fully appreciate until now. When you're young, it's easy to get caught up in what other people see. You think you need the big house, the expensive car, the perfect vacation photos. But those things fade. They lose their shine. Someone else always has something newer, something bigger, something louder. But quiet wealth, the wealth of stability, of character, of having enough and knowing it's enough, that's the kind that lasts. What my family never understood is that I wasn't playing the same game they were. They were chasing trophies. I was building a life. And the life I built? It's one where I don't have to chase anyone's approval. It's one where I can sit in my modest apartment, drive my old car, and feel completely at peace because I know I'm living on my own terms. It's one where I can say no to deals that don't align with my values, where I can walk away from conversations that only exist to inflate someone's ego. Most of all, it's a life where I can give back, where I can use what I've built to create opportunities for other people, not just stack more trophies on a shelf. Preserving Grandma's mansion and turning it into a foundation headquarters wasn't just a way to save a building. It was a way to carry forward the spirit of what she believed in. Financial education, affordable housing, community investment, those are the things that actually change lives. And isn't that the point? All those years, my family measured success by how loudly they could display it. But quiet success, the kind that doesn't beg for attention, that's where the real power is. The power to live freely. The power to help others. The power to walk into a room knowing exactly who you are no matter who's sitting at the table. And yes, they changed after the reveal. Suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. Suddenly, they wanted to invite me to their private clubs, to include me in their business ventures, to have me speak at their events. But by then, I didn't need their validation. The people who rushed to embrace me after learning about my portfolio were the same people who wouldn't have glanced twice at me before. It was telling. Some relationships I chose to nurture, others I let drift. Because wealth, I realized, also buys you the privilege of choosing who gets access to you. Jessica and I remained close. She never needed to see my balance sheet to know my worth. She stood by me before the reveal, and she stood by me after. Do people like her? They're rare. They're worth holding on to. As for Uncle Richard, Brad, Victoria, they adjusted, but I could see it in their eyes. The scramble, the recalibration, the new power dynamics they had to navigate now that the girl they once dismissed held the deciding vote. They treated me with respect now, but it wasn't real. It was strategic. I learned to stop taking it personally. Because here's the truth no one tells you. You can't force someone to respect you for the right reasons. You can only live in a way that makes their disrespect irrelevant. The best revenge, if you even want to call it that, isn't showing them you've won. It's realizing you no longer need them to know you've won. It's building a life so solid, so full, that their opinions don't reach you anymore. Grandma used to say, wealth is a tool, not a trophy. I carry that with me every day. It's the reason I still drive my old Toyota, the reason I still live in the same apartment. Not because I can't afford more, but because I no longer feel the need to prove I can. My wealth isn't about what I wear or where I vacation. It's about the freedom to choose my life. It's about the ability to honor the people who believed in me when no one else did. It's about doing work that matters, not just work that looks good. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. The life you build in silence is often the one that holds the most strength. You don't need to show everyone your worth. Sometimes, the greatest power is in knowing it quietly and carrying it with you wherever you go. The days after my revelation unfolded like the slow settling of dust after an earthquake. Nothing looked quite the same, but the world hadn't completely collapsed, either. There was just this strange, raw quiet, a new family landscape where everyone was trying to figure out how to move forward now that the story they'd told themselves about me had shattered. Uncle Richard was the first to adapt. I should have expected that. He called me the very next day, inviting me to lunch at his exclusive country club, a place he'd never once thought to bring me before. The invitation came wrapped in polite curiosity, but I knew better. It was the beginning of his recalibration. Richard never left loose ends. To him, I had gone from irrelevant to essential in one morning. At lunch, he wore his usual tailored suit and carried his usual air of control, but there was a new undercurrent, one I hadn't seen before. Something like caution. Maybe even respect. I clearly underestimated you, Eliza, he said over the rim of his scotch glass. Perhaps we've all been a bit too quick to judge. I smiled, sipping my water. Perhaps. He offered partnership proposals, ways to combine our holdings, to leverage our shared family influence, but his vision was still the same. He wanted expansion, visibility, control. He still thought wealth was a game of who could build the tallest tower the fastest. I listened, but I didn't commit. If we were going to work together, it would be on my terms now, not his. Aunt Catherine reached out next, inviting me to tea at her country estate. She softened her tone, called me dear more than she ever had before, and carefully danced around years of condescension as if they could simply be rewritten. Family is so important, she said, patting my hand like we had always been close. Despite our little differences, we must stick together. It was almost impressive how quickly some people could rewrite history when it suited them. Brad took longer to approach me. His pride was too big, too loud to recover quickly. But when he finally did, it came in the form of a business pitch, a shiny new development project he claimed needed my unique insight. In other words, he wanted access to my capital. He wanted to be on the right side of my power now. I declined politely, suggesting he revisit some of Grandma's original investment philosophies if he really wanted to build something worthwhile. Not everyone's reaction was transactional. Jessica stayed by my side, just as she promised. She was the one who made me laugh in the days that followed, calling our family a nature documentary in real time, as we watched them scramble to reposition themselves in the new family order. Observe as the Bennetts adapt to their new apex predator, she joked one afternoon over coffee, her eyes sparkling with mischief. The truth is, some of them genuinely tried to change. A few cousins offered awkward but sincere apologies, admitting they had misjudged me, that they had participated in the years of quiet cruelty without ever questioning it. I accepted their words with cautious grace. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't interested in holding grudges. But I was careful now about who I let close, about which bridges I wanted to rebuild, and which ones I preferred to keep at a professional distance. The mansion stayed in the family, but not in the way they expected. Instead of selling it to developers, I transformed it into the headquarters of the Elizabeth Bennet Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to affordable housing initiatives and financial education for underserved communities. Grandma would have loved that. I imagined her walking through the preserved hallways, nodding in quiet approval as we hosted workshops, mentorship programs, and community events in the same rooms where our family had once debated profit margins and luxury upgrades. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very people who had once mocked me for living beneath the Bennett name now attended foundation events at a house they had tried to sell. They smiled for the cameras, they clapped politely at my speeches, and they donated just enough to have their names listed on the event programs. But they knew. We all knew. This house was standing because I had fought for it. Because I had honored the values they had long abandoned. I still lived in my small apartment. I still drove my old Toyota. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. That freedom, the freedom to live without performing, to choose what mattered on my own terms, was the real wealth I'd built. Uncle Richard still pulled up to foundation meetings in his Bentley. But now he greeted me with a handshake he actually meant, no longer seeing me as the family charity case. He understood now that my modesty was a choice, not a limitation. The most meaningful moment came 6 months later at a foundation gala. Martha, our family's longtime housekeeper, approached me with tears in her eyes. She had served our family for decades. She had seen everything. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "Your grandmother visits me in dreams sometimes. She's proud of you. She always said you were the one who truly inherited the Bennett spirit, not the name, not the money, but the heart of it. That was worth more than all the financial victories combined." Without integrity is hollow. Wealth without purpose is a burden. A family without respect is just a collection of strangers. As I sit in Grandma's rose garden now, the one she lovingly tended, the one I preserved through all the battles, I feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Not the kind that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from finally living in alignment with who you really are. The Bennett family is still evolving. Some relationships are healing into something genuine. Others remain distant, and that's okay. I don't need to fix everything. I don't need to be everything to everyone. The mansion that almost became another luxury condo now hosts financial literacy programs for young people like my mother, hardworking, overlooked, full of potential. That feels right. That feels like home. My car is still the same. My apartment is still small. But my life feels full in ways my cousins may never understand. And that's okay too. Life has a way of teaching us that true wealth isn't measured by the size of our homes, the cars we drive, or the labels we wear. It's measured by the freedom to live with integrity, by the courage to honor the values that truly matter. Eliza Bennett's story is a powerful reminder that patience, humility, and quiet perseverance often lead to the most meaningful victories. Sometimes, the greatest strength comes not from showing off what we have, but from standing firm in who we are, even when others dismiss us. In a world that pushes us to chase appearances, her journey teaches us to invest in what lasts: character, purpose, and the ability to uplift others. For those of us in the middle or later chapters of life, it's never too late to live on your own terms, to protect what truly matters, and to leave a legacy rooted in kindness and authenticity, not just wealth. If this story touched you, or if you've ever felt underestimated by those around you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your experience could inspire someone else on their journey. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories that celebrate quiet strength, personal growth, and the power of being true to yourself. If you found value here, please like and share this video so others can learn from Eliza's remarkable example. Together, we can build a community that values substance over show.